Well, hi there, Social Studies 30-1, taking a look at source number 3. We are studying corruption and democracy. So it's a rather lengthy source. I'll give you a few more seconds than usual to study it, and then we'll delve into it. Okay, that should be enough time. So 1964, corruption and bribery scandal in the House of Commons. What had happened, a guy named Lucien Bouchard was in jail uh, facing extradition charges. In other words, he's going to be sent back to the US for trial regarding heroin charges. While he was in a Canadian jail, he approached uh, an aide to the immigration minister, so a member of the cabinet at the time, and got this guy, this aide, to bribe a lawyer to the tune of $20,000 uh, to get him out of jail, so he wouldn't have to face the extradition charge back to the U.S. for criminal punishment. And so anyway, there was an investigation. That is the Dorian Commission. Now, you don't really need to know the Dorian Commission, but as soon as you see the word commission in this context, it means that this is the result of an investigation. And someone investigated what happened, reported back. It looks like it was a guy named Dorian. That's not really important. Um, but what they do find is that the Liberal MP, the friend of Lucien Rivard, was guilty of you know reprehensible actions, going above the rule of law to help his friend get out of jail. But they were not criminal offenses in using his influence to get his friend out of jail. It led to the resignation of the federal justice minister who was overseeing this and really should have known. And if he didn't know, then he should have known. And it became known as the Rivard affair. And what it did was it kind of kick-started democratic reform in Canada. The prime minister at the time, Lester B. Pearson, laid out a code of morality and ethics that forbade conflicts of interest and bribery. It's just odd that you would need to lay this out. I thought elected officials should know better than to do things that are immoral, like bribery, and undertake acts that are conflicts of interest and bribery. It just seems ironic and unnecessary that you would need to tell someone that. But anyway, that's just kind of my opinion on it. So it's just one more example of corruption, scandal, and democracy. It demonstrates that democracy is not a perfect system. Um, there's not a whole lot that you need to really specifically interpret in the source. And, if you were writing the diploma, I would say be ready for sources like this. What you see is what you get. There's not a whole lot you need to figure out and interpret. But what you're doing is you're pointing out kind of a sequence of events and what happened and how the culmination, all of this led to um, ethics commissions and the actual ethics commissioner that we have in Canada today, Dion. That's where you would go with this source. You'd want to paraphrase, explain what has actually happened, and then the integral part of this interpretation would be linking it to our course terminology. Obviously, the aide to the immigration minister put himself above the rule of law. He did that to try and get his friend out of jail by bribing an American lawyer. And when you do that, when you go above the rule of law, individual rights and freedoms are people are going to lose them somehow and in some way. Now, Rivard was in jail for heroin trafficking, And so, you could talk a little bit about the damage that drugs and heroin will do to a society, maybe the more vulnerable and so on, and talk about how letting him go free, in a sense, is almost aiding and abetting the sale and trafficking of heroin because that's what he was doing, and how that might affect the population, especially people that are at risk. And maybe you throw in self-interest there as well, because here you have again an aide to the immigration minister putting his own self-interest first above the rule of law to help his friend and not do what is best for society, which is, letting that guy go to jail because he was trafficking heroin. In terms of relationships, or I should say perspectives, here is someone who is challenging liberalism. He's saying, look at what happens in a democratic country. When people think of Canada, the last thing they would probably think of is the article, the paragraph that you just read. That they don't think of scandal, corruption. That is something that you might think of when you think of other countries, not Canada. And he's saying the fact that this is going on right under our noses and has been since, in this case, 1964, which is when this case happened. He's saying it's probably more prevalent than we think, because if it's happened once and it's been caught and reported, you can bet that it's happened many more times as was not caught and reported on to the public and the media. So he's a person that is challenging liberalism. It needs to be better. We need to be more vigilant in holding our elected officials accountable for their actions. And Pearson's actions were just the beginning of ethics and conduct reform in Canadian politics. That's probably all I would do with that source. I like that one. I just found that one actually on the weekend. While we're doing this, let's do our relationships, and you know this by now. Quickly rehash them. There was source one from earlier in the week, just talking about, again, codes of conduct, um, holding elected officials accountable, etc. And that would give you a healthy democratic culture. We spent some time discussing what a healthy democratic culture might look like. It would be a democracy that is very accountable to the public. Citizens are very vigilant. They are the opposition. The media is widely reporting what's going on with elected officials, and you'd have a lot of transparency in an accountable, healthy democracy. A lot of political transparency. Source number two, this one was just from yesterday. Talks about uh, how democracy quite often devolves into a popularity contest. And, we elect the person that promises a lot of good things in the short term, but is ignoring the well-being of society in the long term, and how we need to be careful about that. And then finally, this was our source from just yesterday, source number three, or I should say just today. So our next step is to build our relationships. So what I think when I look at them, clearly they're all talking about democracy, but be more specific. They're talking about scandal and corruption in democracy. They're talking about the imperfections in democracy. And so again, the first relationship is that you establish a concept common to all three sources. And if we're talking about corruption in democracy, imperfection in democracy, we now link each source to that concept. Clearly, source one is source two, and source three. And then we need to find one more relationship. I was thinking that in looking at this, it almost looks like uh, sources two and three might have happened first. And then source one is kind of the result of that, the recognition that, there's something wrong, there's something flawed with democracy, and you get democracies now passing legislation and codes of conduct to keep their elected officials more accountable. That's probably where I'd go with my relationships. I wish we were back in class because I'd like to hear what you have to say. Um, Yours are always better than mine. Thanks.